Whew. Is it 5 o'clock yet? It's 5 o'clock somewhere, as the saying goes. The phrase, made popular by comedian Red Skelton in the late 50s and later used in the 2003 Jimmy Buffett song of the same name, insinuates that since we live on a great big planet with the sun always shining, then somewhere on Earth it's gotta be 5 o'clock, giving us all an excuse to practice some casual hedonism. But how often is it really 5 o'clock? And what would be the most 5 o'clocks that a day on Earth could ever theoretically have? It seems like it should be a simple answer. 24, right? Well, it turns out that the way we organize time is a little bit more complicated, and so the answer isn't so straightforward. So let's break it down into several parts, starting with the easiest and then getting more obscure and complex as we go. But first, some ground rules. Rule number 1, we are only counting the minute of 5 p.m. that is local time in any given time zone, or 1700 on a 24-hour clock. If we think about 5 o'clock as a full hour, then time starts to overlap and gets confusing. Plus, it isn't exactly helpful when just counting how many times it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Rule number 2, we are only going to look at a single day for the number of 5 o'clocks. Notice the use of the word day here, meaning a single calendar date. Some days, such as when clocks change because of daylight savings time, there can be calendar days that are only 23 hours long, or as long as 25 hours. Rule number 3. 2 different days will count as 2 different times. So for example, 5 o'clock on Wednesday in Honolulu, Hawaii, and 5 o'clock on Thursday in Christmas, Kiribati are 2 different times, even though they happen at the same moment and the same time of day. The reason for this is, well, let's be honest. Some hours need 2 drinks rather than just 1. So we'll go ahead and count these as 2 separate 5 o'clocks. Rule number 4. The time zones picked for the examples in this video, unless explicitly stated, do not represent all countries or territories that use that specific Universal Coordinated Time, or UTC, offset. The chosen time zones are arbitrary. It would take more than a day, or we could say more than a few 5 o'clocks, to list every single time zone. Last, rule number 5. Much of the information about what is and isn't a time zone comes from the time zone database, which is usually where a lot of programs like Windows, macOS, and Android get their information to set their time on their computer program and operating systems. Given the wide use and standardization of the time zone database, it's good for a project like this. The use of the time zone database does come with some caveats. Most importantly, the time zone database only records time zones and changes since 1970, but it's the best resource we have for right now. Now on to Part 1, on the hour. Starting with the most basic and well-known time zones, let's talk about the hour differences. If we're in London, which is in the time zone of UTC plus or minus 0, then on January 1st, 2021, over a 24-hour period from midnight to midnight, there would be 27 different 5 o'clocks around the world on the hour, as shown in the chart here. There are 27 instead of 24 because of the 3 time zones of UTC plus 12, 13, and 14 that are located in Funafute and Tuvalu, Nuku'alofa and Tonga, and Christmas and Kiribati respectively. The reason these islands have chosen to be on different days despite being at the same longitude is because time zones are made by people, and so the islands have decided to line up their days with their largest trading partner. So for example, Christmas has decided to be on the same day as Australia, whereas Honolulu, which has the same local time but is a day behind, has decided to be on the same day as the US. However, time zones don't always fit nicely on the hour, which brings us to Part 2, half and quarter past. Not all time zones conform to the hour. In fact, there are 11 time zones that are off by 15, 30, or 45 minutes. They are, going in the chronological order of midnight to midnight in London, the Marquesas Islands of French Polynesia, the Chatham Islands of New Zealand, Adelaide, Darwin, and Eucla all on the island of Australia, Yangon in Myanmar, Kathmandu in Nepal, Kolkata in India, Kabul in Afghanistan, Tehran in Iran, and St. John's in Newfoundland, Canada, which would mean that on January 1st, 2021, over a 24-hour period from midnight to midnight, there would be 38 different 5 o'clocks, which you can see in the new modified chart here. So now we have our answer, right? It's 5 o'clock somewhere 38 different times a day, which is more than enough drinks, don't you think? We're done, right? Part 3. What about daylight savings? So since we're trying to figure out the maximum amount of 5 o'clocks in a given day, we're going to have to start talking about how daylight savings time affects all of this. Here we need to consider 2 things, local times combining and days getting longer. Starting with the former, Daylight savings time adjusting the hour sometimes leads to territories having the same local time for part of the year and different times for the rest. Residents of the southwest US are likely already familiar with Arizona and California, having the same local time in the summer and having a different local time in the winter. The same thing is the case with Tehran and Kabul. Although their standard times are off by an hour, when Tehran moves their clocks forward for daylight savings time, they have the same local time as Kabul, meaning we lose a 5 o'clock during that part of the year since there is no other territory that follows Tehran's standard time of UTC plus 3:30. So we'll need to only look at times of the year when Tehran is on standard time, which is only between September 22nd and March 22nd. Next, let's talk about how we can have more hours in the day. When clocks fall back at the end of daylight savings time, days gain an hour and become 25 hours long. Because of this, we can double count all the 5 o'clocks at midnight local time at the start of the day, because they will be 5 o'clocks at 11 p.m. at the end of the day. As mentioned earlier, even though places like Honolulu and Christmas have the same local time, they're on different days, meaning we can get 2 5 o'clocks for the price of 1. Additionally, the Chatham Islands also fall on that same hour, so they get double counted as well. So if we start our day in Halifax, Canada on November 7th, 2021, or anywhere else that goes from UTC -3 to -4, we have the normal 37 time zones discussed before, plus we get an additional 2 bonus 5 o'clocks because it'll be 5 o'clock in Honolulu and Christmas at both 12 a.m. local time and 11 p.m. local time. And the Chatham Islands double count too, having a 5 o'clock at both 12:15 a.m. and 11:15 p.m. local time, giving us a grand total of 41 5 o'clocks. And that's a perfectly acceptable answer. 41 unique 5 p.m.s on November 7th, 2021. Only if you live in the time zone that changes its clocks from UTC -3 to UTC -4. But the thing is, if we go back just 3 years to 2017, we'll arrive at a different answer. Part 4, Back to the Past. In 2017, Pyongyang, North Korea was in the time zone of UTC plus 8:30. This means that on November 7th of that year, we'd have a total of 42 5 o'clocks. Or if we travel even a little further back to 2015, when Caracas, Venezuela was in the time zone of UTC -4:30, we'd arrive at a total of 43 5 o'clocks. This opens up the new and exciting world of time zones no longer in use. This also leads to things getting weird and a bit harder to explain, since there's not always a clear paper record of when and where time zones were used. So it makes sense to rely on the time zone database. The database begins its records on January 1st, 1970, and it is one of the most comprehensive histories of time zone changes that have occurred in the last 50 years. So we're only going to look at the span of time since January 1st, 1970. Anything else gets into questionable territory, taking place before worldwide standardization and also precise measurement. But not surprisingly, if we go back to 1970, we find many time zones that have since been made defunct, like -10:30 in Rarotonga Cook Islands and +7:30 in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. But we also lose some time zones, such as -14 in Christmas, Kiribati, and +5:45 in Kathmandu, Nepal. Additionally, things get confusing here, since time zones sometimes exist and then don't. Like Norfolk Island, Australia, where they occupied UTC +12:30 from 74 to 75 during daylight savings time, but haven't observed DST since, and so the time zone hasn't existed since then. Let's count time zones in the same order that we had before, starting simple and then slowly getting more complicated. First, I'll just tell you the final location of Washington, D.C., which ends up having the most 5 o'clocks because of its geographic location. And for right now, we'll stay on January 1st, 1970, so we don't have to worry about daylight savings time changes. We have 24 5 o'clocks for each hour of the day, and 2 for UTC +12 and 13, since we don't yet have a +14 time zone. So now, our current total is 26. Then we have the 16 off-hour time zones, which are the island of Niue, the Chatham and Pitcairn Islands of New Zealand, Darwin and Eucla in Australia, Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, Yangon in Myanmar, Kolkata in India, Kabul in Afghanistan, Tehran in Iran, Monrovia in Liberia, St. John's in Canada, Georgetown in Guyana, Marquesas in French Polynesias, Rarotonga of the Cook Islands, and Christmas in Kiribati, all of which fall in a variety of different off-hour differences, bringing the total number of 5 o'clocks up to 42. Now let's talk about daylight savings time. Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic originally adjusted its clocks by just 30 minutes during daylight savings time in the early 70s, an uncommon but not unheard of practice. We would want to look for our final date only during Santo Domingo's daylight savings, restricting our calendar year window, because when Santo Domingo is following standard time, they're at UTC -5, meaning counting them would be redundant. So now let's look at that bonus 5 o'clock during Santo Domingo's daylight savings time, which would mean between October and January. So now, looking only in our restricted calendar window, let's do that same Halifax trick we did before, allowing us to double count the plus 12 and 13 time zones because daylight savings is weird. So again, we get another 2 bonuses on October 25th, 1970 of the Pacific Island cities of Pago Pago and Samoa, and Nuku'alofa and Tonga, plus the 2 other time zones that fall in that same hour of Chatham Islands and Niue, bringing our grand total to 47 5 o'clocks. And this is the end of our journey, at least for now, unless time zones change in the future, which is more than likely, or we start worrying about time on Mars, which is its own wonderful chaotic box. We can confidently say that the most 5 o'clocks any day has had since accurate time recordings began in 1970 has been 47, which is quite honestly more than enough drinks. Cheers.
Sick at all. Got fighting mad and lost his cool, so we took him by the hand. Said, cool it, Doc, watch that clock, you're in Newfoundland. Half an hour later, on an island